I was about to give my son $780,000. Then I overheard a phone call that made me decide to sink his entire future instead. Hello, everyone. My name is Harold Brennan. Everyone calls me Hal. I'm a retired naval architect. After my wife passed, my world went quiet in a way I never fully adjusted to. Margaret and I were married 34 years. She used to say I talked to blueprints the way other men talk to their dogs, and she wasn't entirely wrong. When she died, the house on Cormorant Lane went from full to hollow overnight, and I filled the silence the only way I knew how, by throwing myself deeper into the one language I'd always trusted completely: structure, tolerance, load, the honest mathematics of things that either hold or don't. People don't lie the way steel does. Steel just tells you the truth about how much weight it can bear. I wish I'd applied that same standard to my own family a lot sooner than I did. Only Derek remained, my only son. I watched him grow up. I watched him marry Vanessa. I always believed a father's job was to be the keel that keeps his child's life steady in rough water. I was willing to give everything to make sure of it. I planned to transfer my entire life savings to him and his wife. $780,000. An enormous sum. It was 31 years of shipyard contracts, sleepless nights over blueprints, hulls I designed that were still out there cutting through the Atlantic. I wanted them to have a clean launch. I'd finished the paperwork. The check sat folded inside my jacket pocket. The trust documents already carry my signature. All I had to do was hand it over. I thought I'd see my son's face light up. I thought I'd spend my old age surrounded by family. But a vessel doesn't fail because of the storm. It fails because of a crack nobody inspected closely enough. Instead of handing over $780,000, I spent the following week engineering a controlled sinking they never saw coming. Betrayal never comes from just one direction. It starts as a hairline fracture below the waterline, invisible, quietly widening, until the hull can't take the pressure anymore and the whole compartment floods at once. Let me tell you about the afternoon my own hull cracked. It was a gray Friday. I stood outside Derek's house with a folder under my arm containing a check for $780,000. I wanted to surprise them. I didn't knock. I wanted to walk in and watch my son's face when he saw it. My hand froze on the doorknob. A sound slipped through the gap in the sliding glass door. Vanessa's laugh. Sharp, cold, cutting straight through. She was on speakerphone, some man's voice coming through with calculated confidence. The two of them discussing the formation of a Shell LLC. Vanessa laughed and said the old man was about to walk right into it. That old man was me, standing outside with a check that represented my entire working life. Trembling. I stood there in shock, every sense locked on high alert. My mind doing what it's always done under pressure, running the numbers, checking the math. I caught fragments before the full shape of it settled in. A figure, an account number recited too smoothly, the specific practice cadence of two people who'd clearly rehearsed this conversation more than once before I ever stood on that porch. Vanessa was explaining how they'd move all of my money into the LLC's account, then use it to buy a condo titled solely in her name. But what actually broke something in my chest wasn't Vanessa's greed. It was Derek's agreement. My son. I could see his silhouette through the frosted glass, sitting across from her, and I heard him sigh, then say a sentence cold enough to cut clean through 30 years of memory. Dad's going to be a real problem lately. He's slipping. Putting him somewhere with real care is honestly the best thing for everybody. Your plan's perfect, he told her. Just do it. A problem. An old man slipping. That was how they decided to describe the keel that had kept their whole lives upright. My chest tightened like something structural, giving way all at once. Betrayal from a stranger can wound you. Betrayal from your own blood is the kind that opens the hull below the waterline, where you can't see it happening until you're already sinking. They had no idea I was standing right outside that door. They kept going, sketching out how they'd spend my money, laughing at my age, my trust. Vanessa turned the diamond on her finger and told Derek to hurry up and finish the paperwork, declaring me mentally incompetent. They wanted me locked away, stripped of my say in anything. Before they'd taken the last dollar, the initial pain faded fast, and in its place came something colder, running straight down my spine. Whatever warmth I had left for either of them drained out completely. A crack had opened, and I knew this hull could never be patched. I looked down at the folder in my hands and I smiled. The smile of a man who builds things for a living, and who also knows exactly how to take them apart. They wanted a game. I'd give them a flood. I never walked through that door. I turned around and left in silence, already sketching the counterattack in my head, already certain my first move was going to cost them more than either of them could imagine. I got in my truck, shut the door, and the world went silent except my own breathing. I looked in the rear view. Old face, deep lines, but my eyes weren't carrying a father's warmth anymore. They were the color of cold steel plate. I thought, sitting there about the day Derek was born, how I'd stood in that hospital hallway convinced I understood exactly what kind of father I was going to be. Patient, generous, the kind of man who built things that lasted. 40 years later, I was sitting in a parked truck outside his house, tearing up his inheritance, and somehow it still felt like the same principle applied. You build things to last. You just don't always get to choose what needs building or what needs to come down first. I opened the folder on my lap. The check sat there quietly, once a symbol of everything I'd wanted to give. Now just fuel for two people's greed. I tore it. The sound was sharp and final in that small cab, like a rivet popping loose under strain. I shredded the check into pieces, then the trust documents too, and watched the scrap settle on the floor mat. The grief lasted about 4 minutes, the length of the drive from Derrick Street to the main road. After that, the engineer in me took over completely. I didn't cry. I didn't turn around to scream or demand an explanation. Pointless. When a structure's rotted through from the inside, you don't repair it. You bring it down with precision, on your own terms. I started the truck and drove into a light rain, my mind already laying out the blueprint. They wanted to prove I was incompetent so they could take everything. They thought I was a soft old man. They could steer wherever they wanted. That was their first mistake. They'd forgotten who raised them, a man who spent 3 decades designing hulls that survived open ocean. I was about to show them exactly what that kind of mind does when it decides to take something apart. No violence, just the law and their own greed as the charge. I called Warren, my oldest friend, a maritime and estate attorney with an office 2 towns over, the only man alive who could help me draft this. He'd known me over 25 years, since we'd served on the same yacht club board back when I still had the energy for committee meetings. The second he saw my face, he knew something had shifted. I sat down and got straight to it. Warren, I want a full audit of every account Derek and Vanessa have ever touched. He didn't ask many questions, just started typing. Lines of account data scrolling past. Every figure felt like another rivet driven straight into my chest. Warren has the particular gift of a man who spent 3 decades reading other people's financial disasters without ever once flinching visibly, and I watched that composure hold steady even as the numbers on his screen got worse. At one point he paused, rubbed his eyes, and said, quietly, that he was sorry that this was one of the harder audits he'd run in a while. Coming from Warren, who'd handled 2 divorces and a bankruptcy for me over the years without so much as raising an eyebrow, that meant something. The audit turned up things I wasn't ready for. Over the past year, Vanessa had quietly pulled $48,000 from one of my secondary accounts. And that wasn't the worst of it. There was a pending transfer request. Derek trying to move $220,000 out of my retirement fund. Initiated the same afternoon, I'd been standing outside their door with a check in my hand. They couldn't even wait. They wanted to drain me while I was still breathing. Warren looked at me carefully and asked if I wanted to go to court immediately. I shook my head. Sue them now, and they'd just return the money, maybe get probation. Far too gentle for what they'd shown me through that glass door. I wanted a total collapse, the kind that can't be salvaged or spun. I stared at the account data on his screen, and my mind found the weak point in their whole plan the way it always found the weak point in a whole design. They needed capital to keep the Shell LLC alive. They were desperate to close on that condo. They thought I knew nothing, still saw me as a confused old man carrying a check full of love. I turned to Warren with a cold smile. Freeze that 220 transfer, I told him quietly, and then we give them exactly what they're asking for, with a Trojan horse built into the fine print that sinks the whole thing the second they touch it wrong. Warren understood immediately, something between surprise and admiration crossing his face as he opened a blank document. This wasn't a gift agreement. It was a financing instrument, designed to be devastating. We stayed at his office until nearly 2 in the morning finishing it. I knew Derek and Vanessa were probably home celebrating, certain the money would be theirs any day. They had no idea the real storm hadn't even made landfall yet. Warren typed the final clauses while I watched, the office silent except for the keyboard. The trap was complete. not a gift. A business financing contract from Bellwether Capital, an investment fund Warren and I had set up specifically for this. Legally, the $780,000 would transfer into Vanessa's Shell LLC, but attached to it were extraordinarily tight conditions. The funds could only be used to capitalize a legitimate commercial venture. $1 spent on a private condo or personal expense, and the whole thing sprang shut, defined right there in the contract as financial fraud. To an ordinary reader, dry legal boilerplate. To me, they were charges set at every load-bearing point of the structure. The moment Vanessa redirected that money toward the condo, the alarm would trip, federal investigators would step in, and no attorney on earth would talk them out of it. Warren asked if I was sure I wanted to sign, because signing meant playing a confused old man in front of my own son. I didn't hesitate. I signed on behalf of the fund, and the ache inside me had already gone quiet. I was just an engineer doing his job, taking apart something that had already rotted past saving. I understood exactly how greed would blind them. The second they saw $780,000, they'd never bother reading the appendix. They'd sign immediately, certain they'd outsmarted the old man, congratulating themselves on how easily the nursing home plan was falling into place. I folded the document into my coat pocket, shook Warren's hand, and walked out into a city that had gone to sleep around us, while something inside me stayed wide awake. I texted Derek that night, told him I missed them, wanted to come by the next evening with a special gift. He wrote back within minutes, dripping with a warmth I no longer trusted an ounce of. I smiled and put the phone away. Tomorrow's dinner was going to be the moment. I personally handed them a box they'd open with excitement and never see the inside of clearly until it was already too late. I showed up at their door at 7 the next evening in an old, worn coat, shoulders deliberately slumped, projecting exactly the tired old man they wanted to see. Vanessa answered with the brightest smile I'd seen on her in years, and my eyes caught the detail immediately. A diamond bracelet on her wrist, the kind that cost tens of thousands, bought, I now knew, with the $48,000 she'd quietly siphoned from my account. She wore it while welcoming me into her home. The shamelessness landed like ice water, but I buried it, stepped inside with deliberately unsteady footsteps. Dinner was lavish, more elaborate than anything I'd seen at their table in years. A roast, some wine I doubted either of them could tell one grape from another on, candles they'd clearly bought specifically for the occasion of fooling me. Derek kept piling food onto my plate, asking about my health in the sweetest voice he owns, the voice I remembered from when he was small and wanted something he knew I'd normally say no to. Vanessa could barely contain her impatience for the gift, checking her phone twice, refilling my water glass before I'd taken more than a sip. I pressed a hand to my forehead, mumbled something disoriented about not remembering if I'd taken my afternoon pills. I caught the two of them trading a glance, a flicker of victory crossing both their faces. They believed I'd slipped completely. They believed the nursing home plan was going to be effortless. With a deliberate tremble, I pulled the Bellwether folder from my coat and set it on the table, telling them in a weak voice it was a gift for their new company. Vanessa snatched it up, eyes lit with pure want, flipping straight to the page with a number on it. Exactly as I'd predicted, greed blinded her to every page of fine print stapled behind it. She elbowed Derek. He grabbed a pen. They signed fast, urgently, like they were afraid I might change my mind, never once understanding that every stroke of ink was another charge set along the hull of their own future. I tucked my copy back into my pocket, told them I was tired, and let them walk me to the door with exaggerated tenderness. From the truck, I glanced back through the window and watched them dancing around the living room, certain they'd beaten the old man. As I started the engine, I already knew. The charges were set. Their very next move was going to bring the whole thing down, and they'd be the ones pulling the trigger. 3 days after that dinner, Derek showed up at my house alone, no Vanessa, carrying a thick folder and a face arranged in a careful concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent. He sat across from me, gentle and persuasive, told me my memory had been slipping, that I needed real care somewhere better equipped. I noticed, even through the performance I was giving him, that his hands weren't quite steady either, and some small useless part of me wondered if some fraction of him actually believed the story he was telling, or whether it was easier for him to function if he did. He slid the pen and the paperwork across the table and told me all I had to do was sign, that he'd handle the rest. I looked at my only son, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing warm toward him at all. He was personally helping build the walls around the man who'd raised him. I didn't argue. I let my eyes drift around the room in practiced confusion, picked up the pen with a shaking hand, and signed, but not my real signature. Warren had walked me through exactly how to do it. I deliberately misspelled my own middle name, abandoned my normal handwriting for crude block letters, let the ink smear where my hand shook on purpose. Derek watched, holding his breath, and the second I finished he grabbed the papers with visible relief, certain he'd pulled it off, and left like a man who'd just taken a kingdom. He had no idea that petition, block letters, and misspelled name and all, was the single strongest piece of evidence I now had that my own child had coerced me while I was not acting of my own free will. He just handed me the last piece I needed. I watched his truck disappear down the road. Tomorrow was Monday, the day Vanessa had scheduled a signing at the real estate office, closing on a condo that would be titled solely in her name, funded with money she believed was already hers. They had no idea Warren and I would be there too, with a presentation of our own. The office was flooded with sunlight Monday morning, thick with Vanessa's perfume. She sat in a leather chair with the confidence of a woman about to be crowned. Derek beside her, both their faces lit up like people who thought they'd already won. On the table sat the purchase documents for a condo worth nearly $1 million. The agent slid the contract toward her. She picked up a fountain pen, diamond bracelet catching the light, glanced at Derek with pride, and began to sign. The instant the pen touched paper, the glass door swung open. Warren and I walked in. Vanessa's smile froze. Derek shot up out of his chair. Both of them stared at me like they were looking at a stranger. I wasn't wearing the Warren coat anymore. No trembling steps. I stood straight, in a dark tailored suit, looking less like a frail retiree and more like the man who used to walk shipyard floors approving hulls before they touched water. My eyes stayed fixed on them, steady, unreadable. The real estate agent, a young man who clearly had no idea what he just walked into the middle of, looked between the four of us with the particular panic of someone whose Monday morning commission was disintegrating in real time. "Dad," Derek stammered, his eyes dropping to the folder in my hand, the same folder he'd pressured me to sign 3 days earlier. Panic crept into his face as he realized my confusion at dinner had been an act from the start. I walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down across from them calm. Warren set a leather case on the table, looked at the agent, and told him to halt the transaction immediately. The agent stared at us, confused. Vanessa recovered from the shock first, and her greed came roaring right back. She slammed her hands on the table, stood, shouted that I had no right to interfere, that the $780,000 already belonged to her LLC, that the financing agreement had been legally signed. The agent, still frozen behind his desk, looked like a man calculating how fast he could reasonably excuse himself to the break room. I didn't argue with her. I just looked at Warren. He gave the agent a professional smile, then pulled a document bearing an official seal from a federal financial regulator out of his case and announced, clearly, that every dollar in the LLC's account had been frozen 2 hours earlier. Evidence of financial misconduct and diversion of business financing funds for unauthorized purposes. The color drained out of Vanessa's face. The fountain pen dropped from her fingers and hit the floor. Derek staggered backward. In the silence, you could practically hear both their hearts pounding. Their coronation had turned into an arraignment, and that wasn't even the worst of it. Warren reached into the case again and pulled out a second document, a single page that was about to detonate whatever was left of their world. An emergency warrant. 2 uniformed officers stepped into the office behind us. Vanessa let out a scream and grabbed the table edge to keep from going down. Warren read the charges aloud: federal financial fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy to seize a senior citizen's assets, organized theft. Every piece of evidence was already assembled. The recording from outside the house, the records of the unauthorized $48,000 withdrawal, the frozen attempt on $220,000 from my retirement account, and, most damning of all, the incompetency petition bearing a coerced, misspelled, block letter signature. Undeniable proof of duress. Derek stood frozen, ash-colored, staring at me with desperate eyes before he started to cry, begging forgiveness, insisting Vanessa had manipulated him, that he was still my son. I looked at him and felt nothing but cold. The bond between a father and son isn't a fixed structure. It needs maintenance from both sides, constant upkeep against the elements. The moment he agreed to lock me away, the last support keeping that bond upright had already sheared clean off its foundation. I turned my head. The officers stepped forward. The click of handcuffs echoed through the room. They cuffed Vanessa first. At almost the same moment, a notice came through from the State Real Estate Licensing Board. Her license permanently revoked. Her career finished before the cuffs were even fully closed. By the time they were walked out to the sidewalk, every trace of arrogance had drained out of both of them. Only panic remained. The mask cracked completely the moment they hit open air. Vanessa turned on Derek, screaming that he was weak, pathetic, spineless. He didn't stay quiet either, shouting right back that her greed had dragged them both into this. Two people who'd promised each other forever were tearing each other apart on a public sidewalk. Their own structure was crushing itself without a single further push from me. People stopped to watch. Some pointed. A few filmed it on their phones. It was the most satisfying collapse I have ever witnessed in my life. I stood there and watched everything they built come apart at once, exactly as engineered. But once the storm passed, one question remained. What was I supposed to do with the rest of my own life? The patrol car doors slammed shut, and Derek and Vanessa disappeared toward the county detention facility. As the sound of the sirens faded into the city, I understood it was finally time to make the last decision that belonged only to me. The noise dropped away, and all that was left was clean air and quiet. I went home, gathered up the things worth keeping, and sold a house. Too many cracks in that foundation to live with anymore. I moved to a small cottage on the Rhode Island coast, near enough to the water to hear at night. The boathouse took the better part of a year to finish, longer than any project I'd ever signed off on professionally, mostly because I insisted on doing half the joinery myself, instead of just stamping the drawings and walking away like I used to when I was younger and busier and, I'll admit, less patient. Warren drove up most weekends to check on progress and complain about the seagulls. By spring, we had 6 kids from the county youth program out on the water in prams I designed myself. Wide and forgiving and nearly impossible to capsize, because I'd had more than enough capsizing in my own life for one lifetime, and wanted these particular hulls to be as steady as I could make them. Every morning I sat on the porch with coffee and a set of drafting tools I hadn't touched in years, and using 30 years of shipbuilding knowledge, I designed something new, a community boathouse and sailing program for kids without the means to ever set foot on a hull otherwise. The whole thing funded by the $780,000 that was always meant to build somebody a future, just not the future I'd originally planned. My life now is simple and quiet. I found something like steady water again. Looking at drafting plans spread across my desk some evenings, I keep landing on the same truth. In shipbuilding, a compromised hull doesn't repair itself. Life runs the same way. When betrayal corrodes something down to the frame, covering the crack only guarantees the whole thing goes under eventually. Unconditional love was never supposed to mean unconditional surrender. A good father protects the people he loves, but he also has to have the nerve to cut away whatever's eating his family from the inside, no matter whose name is on it. Keep your keel straight, no matter how much the water around you wants to pull you off course. Warren still comes by most Sundays. We sit on the porch, watch the kids rig the prams badly, and then progressively less badly as the summer goes on, and neither of us talks much about Derek or Vanessa anymore. Some structures, once they fail, aren't worth the engineering it would take to bring them back. I learned that the hard way, at an age when I thought I'd already learned every hard lesson a life like mine had left to teach. Turns out the sea always has one more.